On the 10th of May 1508, Michelangelo Buonarroti began working on painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome after being commissioned by Pope Julius II. He finished the initial work in 1512 and returned again in 1535 to paint the Last Judgment. This is one of the world's most iconic works of art, yet Michelangelo viewed himself as a sculptor rather than a painter. How did someone who did not even primarily consider himself to be a painter by trade produce some of the most famous paintings in human history? This is the story of Michelangelo, painter of the Sistine Chapel. The man known to history as Michelangelo was born Michelangelo di Ludovico Buonarroti Simoni on the 6th of March 1475 in the village of Caprese in the upper Tiber Valley near Arezzo in eastern Tuscany. The village was later named Caprese Michelangelo in the artist's honor. The painter is generally known simply as Michelangelo. Michelangelo's father was Ludovico Buonarroti. He served as a chief magistrate or podestà of Caprese on behalf of the Republican government of Florence, the city that ruled over most of Tuscany in the 15th century. Michelangelo later claimed that the family were descended from Countess Matilda of Canossa, a prominent 11th century power broker who supported the papacy against the Holy Roman Empire in the investiture controversy. Despite this claim, the family's lineage can only be reliably traced to some 13th century Florentine wool merchants. While several Buonarrotis held high office in Florence, by the time of Michelangelo's birth, the family's status was in decline, and Ludovico was later disqualified from serving the government after falling into debt in the 1480s. Michelangelo's mother, Francesca di Neri di Miniato del Serra, was in her late teens when she married Ludovico Buonarroti. Francesca was related to the prominent Rucellai family, but otherwise very little is known about her. She gave birth to her first son, Leonardo, in 1473, 2 years before Michelangelo's birth in 1475. Over the next 6 years, she had 3 more sons, Buonarrotto, Giovanni Simone, and Sigismondo. She died in 1481, likely from complications following the birth of her youngest son. Ludovico's term as podestà of Caprese ended a few weeks after Michelangelo's birth, and the family returned to Florence. A compact city with a population of 60,000 people, Florence was not only a powerful city-state, but an artistic and intellectual powerhouse that set the stage for the Italian Renaissance. The poet Dante wrote his Divine Comedy here in the 13th century, a landmark work in the inception of the Italian Renaissance. His contemporary Giotto designed the iconic bell tower of Florence Cathedral in the 1330s. A century later, the architect Filippo Brunelleschi designed and built the cathedral's iconic octagonal dome, the largest since antiquity. While Florence was officially a republic at the time of Michelangelo's birth, the city was dominated by the Medici banking family, who had translated their wealth into political power. Ludovico Buonarroti and his brother Francesco lived with their families in a rented house on the Via de' Bentacordi in the east of the city near the church of Santa Croce, which was already teeming with masterpieces by Florentine artists such as Giotto and the sculptor Donatello. Outside the church, the young Michelangelo would have encountered a wall of colour as the city's dyers hung their fabric out to dry in open sheds. Michelangelo's familiarity with textiles, their colouring and design, would have helped him as a painter. During his earliest years, Michelangelo was brought up by a wet nurse at the family farm in the nearby village of Settignano. The area was known for its quarries, and Michelangelo later reflected that it was no coincidence that he became a sculptor. While Michelangelo returned to Florence after being weaned from his wet nurse, he frequently accompanied his family on trips to Settignano during his childhood. In around 1485, when Michelangelo was 10 years old, Ludovico sent him to study Latin grammar with Francesco da Urbino. This was a sign of the family's social ambitions, since a Latin education paved the path to a career in law, government, or the church. Despite Ludovico's aspirations for his son, Michelangelo was far more interested in becoming an artist. As a young child, he enjoyed copying Giotto's frescoes at Santa Croce, and at around 10 years old, he befriended Francesco Granacci, a young artist 5 years his senior, who was then working in the workshop of the painter Domenico Ghirlandaio. Granacci encouraged Michelangelo's artistic aspirations by inviting him to Ghirlandaio's studio and giving him drawings to copy, and the boy soon abandoned his Latin lessons. While Florence was a well-established centre of art, not all Florentines respected artists, and Ludovico regularly beat his son for preferring art over a more respectable career. Nevertheless, by 1487, the 12-year-old Michelangelo joined Granacci as an apprentice in Ghirlandaio's workshop. Ghirlandaio was then at the height of his fame, and Michelangelo may have helped him decorate the main chapel at the church of Santa Maria Novella. As an apprentice, Michelangelo learned fresco and panel painting techniques from Ghirlandaio, but he later sought to distance himself from his master, whose expertise in portraiture and scenes from daily life was diametrically opposed to Michelangelo's interest in grander subjects. Michelangelo developed his skills as an artist by drawing on paper, which was now in great abundance as paper mills sprung up to meet demand, following Gutenberg's invention of the movable type printing press. The mastery of forms Michelangelo developed through drawing was crucial in his later work as a sculptor and architect. Michelangelo was a proactive student who experimented with different media rather than copying what was in front of him. After being shown Martin Schongauer's engraving showing the Temptation of St. Anthony, Michelangelo made a color version by creating a painting based on Schongauer's original illustration. Michelangelo's authorized biographer, Ascanio Condivi, writing within the artist's lifetime, described the young apprentice copying a drawing by Ghirlandaio and returning the copy to his master, who was none the wiser until one of the other apprentices revealed Michelangelo's deception. Ghirlandaio may not have taken kindly to the student's efforts to outsmart his master, but he recognized Michelangelo's talent and gave him his big break in 1490 by introducing him and Granacci to Lorenzo de' Medici, the de facto ruler of Florence, nicknamed Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent. In addition to exercising power over the city from behind the scenes, Lorenzo was a great patron of the arts with an extensive art collection. He hoped to rebuild Florence in the classical style and asked Ghirlandaio for his most talented apprentices to be trained as sculptors. When the two young artists arrived at Lorenzo's sculpture garden in San Marco in spring 1490, they found another apprentice sculptor named Pietro Torrigiano at work on some clay figures. While Michelangelo appears to have had no experience with sculpture before working for Lorenzo, he was confident enough to challenge Torrigiano by making his own clay figures. 3 years older than Michelangelo, Torrigiano resented the challenge, and their rivalry eventually turned violent when Michelangelo made a disparaging remark about Torrigiano's artistic abilities, provoking the latter to punch him in the face, permanently disfiguring his nose. Sculpture became Michelangelo's preferred art form, and he later described conceiving a figure in a marble block in his imagination and removing the material to realize its form. Michelangelo was trained by the sculptor Bertoldo di Giovanni, a pupil of Donatello, who was also Lorenzo's art consultant. By the time Bertoldo died in December 1491, Michelangelo had far surpassed his master. Not long after Michelangelo began working for Lorenzo, he saw an ancient head of an old laughing faun and decided to make a version of his own with the faun's mouth fully open. When Lorenzo came across Michelangelo polishing his sculpture, he was impressed by the teenager's talents, but could not avoid remarking that he had given an old man a full set of teeth. Michelangelo was stung by the criticism, waited for Lorenzo to move on so he could knock out a few of the teeth and show him his amended creation. Lorenzo admired Michelangelo's skill and ambition and moved him into one of the Medici residences in the city. He also requested to meet with the artist's father, who was initially terrified by the summons and horrified that his son was being trained as a sculptor. When Lorenzo promised to help Ludovico secure any government appointment he desired, the latter requested a modest sinecure in the customs office, a pitiful request that embarrassed his son. Michelangelo was proud of being treated as an equal in the Medici household and shared the dinner table with distinguished Florentine intellectuals. However, unlike some of his peers, he did not share the Medici court's interest in music and preferred to focus on his sculpting, copying many pieces by Donatello. With access to the extensive Medici art collection, Michelangelo also took inspiration from classical art. His earliest surviving sculptural works include a shallow-cut piece inspired by Donatello's reliefs, known as the Madonna of the Stairs, and an unfinished piece known as the Battle of the Centaurs, depicting a dramatic classical scene. On the 9th of April 1492, Lorenzo the Magnificent died at the relatively young age of 43. Michelangelo was distraught by the demise of his patron, but he was initially well regarded by Lorenzo's son and successor, Piero de' Medici. Michelangelo is believed to have carved a large marble statue of Hercules as a commission from Piero. This statue ended up in the garden of Fontainebleau Palace in France, but disappeared in the early 18th century when the garden was refurbished. Piero also asked Michelangelo to work on a wooden sculpture of Christ on the cross for the Church of Santo Spirito, whose prior allowed Michelangelo to dissect the bodies of deceased patients in the adjoining hospital for his anatomical studies, an action that was considered a serious crime by many people at the time. The resulting creation appears elongated and out of proportion, though on closer examination it effectively conveys Christ's suffering. Despite enjoying Piero's favor, Michelangelo was also sympathetic to a party who questioned Piero's political abilities and hoped to replace him with Lorenzo and Giovanni di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, who hailed from the dynasty's junior branch. In September 1494, 2 years into Piero's rule, the Italian peninsula was rocked by an invasion by King Charles VIII of France, who laid claim to the Kingdom of Naples. After Piero sided with Naples, the French army marched on Florence, and by mid-October, Michelangelo prudently left for Venice. In early November, Piero was removed from power after surrendering key fortresses to Charles VIII. The son of Lorenzo the Magnificent acquired the less flattering epithet of Piero the Unfortunate on account of the manner in which he held power over the Florentine Republic for such a short period of time. After running out of money in Venice, Michelangelo began making his way back to Florence when the Bolognese aristocrat Gianfrancesco Aldrovandi recognized him and offered him free accommodation at his palazzo in Bologna. Michelangelo was soon commissioned to make 3 small statues for an elaborate new tomb of St. Dominic, the founder of the Dominican order. Without any further commissions, Michelangelo returned to Florence after a year. During his absence, the radical preacher Girolamo Savonarola had emerged as the most influential political figure in the city, instituting a kind of theocracy which reacted against the artistic and cultural renaissance Lorenzo the Magnificent had overseen in the city. Michelangelo nevertheless continued his work, creating an infant St. John the Baptist at this time and a sculpture of the sleeping Cupid, the god of love. While the latter piece was sold to Cardinal Raffaele Riario for 200 ducats, Michelangelo was outraged when the dealer only gave him 30 ducats. In 1496, Michelangelo received Riario's agent Jacopo Galli at his house and mesmerized the latter by drawing a hand with such grace and lightness. After confirming he was the sculptor of the sleeping Cupid, Michelangelo accompanied Galli to Rome and arrived on the 25th of June with a letter of recommendation from Lorenzo da Pierfrancesco de' Medici. Although Rome was the seat of the papacy, it was a shadow of its ancient past, and cultural life here was eclipsed by that of Florence. Cardinal Riario was among the church leaders who hoped to rebuild the city in the style of the Caesars. As soon as Michelangelo arrived at Rome, Riario invited him to examine his classical statue collection. The following day, he was commissioned to make statues of the wine god Bacchus and another of Cupid. Despite the promising start to his career in Rome, Michelangelo fell out with Riario after his drunken, staggering Bacchus proved too realistic for the cardinal's more refined tastes, and the statue ended up in Galli's collection. In his quest for alternative patrons, Michelangelo also re-established contact with Piero de' Medici, who was in Rome in the summer of 1497. Despite being short on funds, Piero may have commissioned a painting known as the Manchester Madonna, which is now on display in the National Gallery in London. While the painting was unfinished, it exhibits Michelangelo's mastery of human anatomy, but lacks the depth of other Florentine painters, such as Ghirlandaio. Michelangelo abandoned the painting when he was commissioned by Cardinal Jean-Billet de l'Agrola to make a sculpture for his funerary monument in St. Peter's Basilica. The French cardinal had been persuaded by Jacopo Galli, who promised him that the resulting creation will be the most beautiful marble that exists in Rome today. Michelangelo lived up to such expectations, and his Pietà, which depicts the dead Christ lying in the arms of the Virgin Mary, is one of his greatest masterpieces. Michelangelo received a princely sum of 450 ducats for the commission and left Rome for several months over the winter of 1497 to 1498 to select the Carrara marble. On his return to Rome, Michelangelo passed through Florence, where Savonarola's theocratic regime was approaching its final days. The fiery preacher was arrested in early April and executed on the 23rd of May. After the marble block arrived in June, Michelangelo spent 2 years carving the sculpture, which combined naturalism with classical beauty in an unprecedented fashion. One of the most intriguing aspects of Michelangelo's Pietà is the youthful appearance of the Virgin Mary, which lends poignancy to the sculpture. By July 1500, the Pietà was installed in the chapel of Saint Petronilla, though it was soon moved elsewhere when the chapel was demolished during rebuilding work. Michelangelo left a Latin inscription bearing his name on the Pietà, which made him a celebrity at the age of 25. Curiously, this is the only work he ever signed his name to. Not long after completing the sculpture, he began working on a painting of Christ being carried to his tomb, which he soon abandoned in favor of a more lucrative opportunity from his native Florence. For several decades, a block of Carrara marble intended for a colossal statue of David sat untouched in the Florentine Office of Works after the sculptor Agostino di Duccio made a poor start, blocking out the figure. As an underdog who defeated the giant Goliath, David was a popular subject in Florentine art. Other sculptors proposed to complete the statue of David by adding other pieces of marble, but Michelangelo aimed to maintain the purity of the single block of marble by depicting his David nude. By the time Michelangelo returned to Florence in spring 1501, Leonardo da Vinci had recently returned to the city from Milan. Leonardo was commissioned to make a large painting of the Madonna and Child with Saint Anne, and exhibited his preliminary drawing for the picture. Michelangelo was among those who saw the drawing on public display, but little is otherwise known about his interaction with the 49-year-old Leonardo on this occasion. By September, Michelangelo began carving David, one of his greatest masterpieces in stone. A few months later, he built a hut around the marble so he could work in secret while allowing only a few select visitors to check on his progress. The statue of David was originally intended to stand on the roof of Florence Cathedral, but as it took shape, the Florentine dignitaries decided that it deserved a more prominent location, though it was also the case that the nude image was considered to be a potentially problematic addition to a religious site. The way this was decided was complex. Following the instability of the Savonarola years, the Florentines elected an official to serve as gonfaloniere for life in autumn 1502. The man in question was Piero Soderini, a politician who had been close to both Lorenzo the Magnificent and Savonarola. Soderini became a close friend of Michelangelo and hoped that the statue of David would stand near the Palazzo della Signoria, now known as the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of the Florentine government and Soderini's permanent residence. By June 1503, the statue was almost complete and exhibited in the Office of Works, but its final position was still undetermined. In January 1504, a committee of artists including Da Vinci and Sandro Botticelli met to consider the location of the statue. While it was agreed that the statue should stand closer to ground level, where Michelangelo's detail could be easily appreciated, the issue was not only artistic but political. A position near the cathedral would elevate the prestige of the church, while its placement near the Palazzo Vecchio would do the same for Soderini's government. The meeting did not come to a clear conclusion, but in May 1504, David was transported to the Piazza della Signoria outside the palace. The sculpture was not universally admired, and its critics included Leonardo, who considered the naked statue vulgar. The Florentines agreed, and David was taken into the courtyard of the Palazzo della Signoria, where it was formally unveiled in September. In focusing on David, Michelangelo had been compelled to set aside other commissions. In May 1501, Galli had secured Michelangelo a new commission from Cardinal Francesco Tedeschini Piccolomini for 14 statues for the Piccolomini altarpiece in Siena Cathedral, which he intended as his own tomb. By summer 1503, when the ailing cardinal made his will, Michelangelo had failed to deliver any statues. After Pope Alexander VI died in August, Piccolomini was elected Pope Pius III a month later, but he lasted less than a month and died in October 1503. While the late Pope was buried at the Vatican, his heirs demanded completion of the altarpiece. By the following October, Michelangelo delivered 4 statues, but never completed the remainder. The quality of the work was substandard, suggesting that he had little interest in the commission. In August 1502, Michelangelo also agreed to make a copy of Donatello's bronze statue of David for the Florentine government as a gift to the French soldier Pierre de Rohanguy. Michelangelo had never worked in bronze before and missed several deadlines for completion, prompting several exasperated letters from Niccolò Machiavelli, then a senior diplomat of the Florentine government. The bronze was cast by October 1503, but remained in a rough state for several years. Michelangelo's failure to meet his deadlines caused great diplomatic embarrassment for Florence, and the bronze was only completed several years later by another artist. Throughout this period, Michelangelo was also in competition with Leonardo. The two men, both venerated by posterity, disagreed violently about art. Leonardo considered painting the nobler discipline, while Michelangelo asserted that sculpture required greater skill. While Leonardo preferred softer lines and used light and shadow to create emotion in his paintings, Michelangelo's paintings are distinguished by sharp outlines and bright colours. With two of the greatest artists in history available, Soderini commissioned Leonardo and Michelangelo to each paint a large battle scene in the great council chamber of the Palazzo della Signoria. Leonardo was to depict the victory of a Florentine-led coalition over the Milanese at the Battle of Anghiari of 1449, while Michelangelo was given the Battle of Cascina in 1364. The Florentine army had been bathing in the river Arno when they were surprised by their Pisan enemy, but nevertheless emerged victorious. The subject matter suited Michelangelo's ability to represent nude male figures in different poses. Both Leonardo and Michelangelo made detailed cartoons of their scenes, and while Leonardo sniped at his younger rival's muscular figures for resembling what he called a sack of walnuts, he was still motivated to carry out his own anatomical studies afterwards to gain a better understanding of Michelangelo's methods. Neither fresco was completed, as Leonardo left for Milan in May 1506, while Michelangelo had not started painting when he was summoned to Rome in February 1505 by Pope Julius II, formerly Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere. Julius is known to history as an ambitious statesman who led armies into battle and broke the power of Cesare Borgia, the son of his rival, the deceased Pope Alexander VI, and the ruler of a large duchy in central Italy that he had carved out there during his father's time as Bishop of Rome. Julius asked Michelangelo to build for him a grand three-level tomb in St. Peter's Basilica, incorporating 40 life-size statues. After being assured of full financial backing from the Vatican, Michelangelo spent 8 months sourcing marble at Carrara. During his absence, Julius launched an even grander project, the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica itself, by his architect Donato Bramante. When Michelangelo returned to Rome in January 1506, he witnessed the rediscovery of a celebrated Roman statue of the Trojan priest Laocoon and his sons being attacked by serpents as a punishment from the gods for advising the Trojans not to accept the Trojan horse as a gift. It was found buried in Rome and excavated. Within a few months, Michelangelo realized that the Pope was losing interest in his tomb, as Julius instead asked the sculptor to repaint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, initially built by his uncle Pope Sixtus IV during the 1470s, but already in disrepair. However, Michelangelo continued to demand money for the tomb from Julius, who was planning a military campaign. When Julius refused to receive Michelangelo, the frustrated and humiliated artist left for Florence in April, prompting the pontiff to send a party of horsemen to bring him back. Michelangelo had already entered Florentine territory by the time they caught up with him and refused their entreaties, informing them that he would never return to Rome. He believed that his rival, Donato Bramante, was behind the Sistine Chapel commission to distract him from working on the tomb. In fact, Bramante advised against commissioning Michelangelo, since the latter was untested as a fresco painter. The Pope insisted on Michelangelo's return and put pressure on the Florentine government to facilitate it. In desperation, the artist even considered going to Constantinople to help Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II build a bridge across the Golden Horn. but dropped the plans after being informed that there would be no demand for sculptures of human figures. Soderini eventually prevailed upon Michelangelo to make his peace with the Pope. In November, Michelangelo met Julius in Bologna, which the pontiff had returned to papal control through decisive military action. Julius desired an appropriate monument to celebrate his triumph, and Michelangelo agreed to cast a large bronze equestrian statue for the Pope in Bologna. The monument lasted less than 4 years before the Bolognese expelled the papal garrison in December 1511 and melted down the statue. After completing the equestrian statue for Julius in March 1508, Michelangelo returned to Florence rather than to Rome. He soon received an urgent summons from the Pope to work on the Sistine Chapel. With St. Peter's far from completion, Julius needed a venue to say Mass, and the chapel's cracked ceiling reflected poorly on the papacy. Under the terms of the original commission, agreed in May 1508, Michelangelo was to paint the 12 apostles in the semicircular lunettes on either side of the vault, while the rest of the ceiling was to have an elaborate geometric pattern. Michelangelo was already familiar with the subject matter, since in 1503 he had been commissioned to produce sculptures of the 12 for Florence Cathedral. But by the time of his summons to Rome in 1505, he had only completed St. Matthew. In order to work without disturbing services in the chapel, Michelangelo designed a series of bridges spanning the vault to accommodate the scaffolding built by his friend Piero Rosselli. After Michelangelo climbed onto the scaffolding in July to appreciate the geometry of the ceiling, he realized that the original conception of the 12 apostles was too simple. He proposed a far more ambitious scheme inspired by the Old Testament. The sides of the vault would feature paintings of the ancestors of Christ. The area between the windows was decorated with enthroned prophets or sibyls who foretold the birth of Christ, while the central area was divided into 9 scenes from the book of Genesis, including the creation of the world, the birth of Adam, and Noah and the Great Flood. Michelangelo asked his friend, the painter Francesco Granacci, to recruit a team of experienced Florentine fresco painters to help him with the ceiling. Starting with the section depicting the Great Flood, the team had to work quickly while the plaster was still wet. However, the plaster they used was too wet and mold began to develop. Following the setback, Michelangelo asked to be relieved of his duties, but the Pope urged him to continue. Much of the fresco had to be removed and repainted. Michelangelo dismissed his helpers and carried on with a smaller team who helped him mix plaster and paint the less important areas, while he personally painted all the scenes and figures. While he was creating his divine masterpiece, perhaps the best-known ceiling painting of all time, Michelangelo complained incessantly about his working conditions in letters to his family. Contrary to popular belief, he painted standing up rather than lying on his back, but was forced to tilt his head backwards. Michelangelo's relationship with his papal patron remained difficult, as the Pope constantly requested progress updates. But by the time the artist was ready to unveil the first half of the ceiling, the Pope had gone to Bologna to raise an army against his erstwhile ally France. When Michelangelo went to Bologna to demand payment from him in late 1510, Julius was seriously ill. He recovered, but his campaign ended in disaster, and by the time he returned to Rome in June 1511, the Sistine Chapel remained a low priority. Starved of funds, Michelangelo made the cartoons for the remaining half of the ceiling, including the creation of Adam and the separation of light from darkness, but also had spare time to write poetry. In addition to his other artistic endeavors, Michelangelo was a renowned poet who wrote over 300 poems during his lifetime. His verses from the early 1510s were among his earliest and criticized both the Pope and corruption in the Church. Michelangelo's troublesome relationship with Julius may also have been motivated by the Pope's patronage of the younger Raphael, whom he commissioned to decorate his private suite in the Apostolic Palace with a series of frescoes between 1509 and 1511. While Raphael's famous School of Athens features prominent thinkers from the ancient world, he based several of the figures on contemporary artists. In the center of the scene, Leonardo is depicted as Plato, pointing his finger towards the heavens, while the seated, brooding figure of Heraclitus in the foreground is reminiscent of Michelangelo's prophets on the Sistine Chapel ceiling and is understood as Raphael's tribute to his great rival. In October 1511, conscious of his own advancing years, Julius gave Michelangelo 400 ducats to finish work on the ceiling as quickly as he could. Michelangelo proceeded to paint the creation of Adam, a task that took him only 16 days. Without artistic precedent, Michelangelo depicted God as an elderly, bearded man, stretching out his right arm to impart the spark of life on the recumbent nude Adam. God is surrounded by a group of human figures, understood to represent the entire human race, within a billowing red cloth shaped like the human brain. While the dozens of male nudes are among the most striking features of Michelangelo's ceiling, their depiction was consistent with artistic and theological currents in Rome. The painted nudes, particularly the 20 ignudi sat on plinths between the main scenes, are inspired by classical statues, while church leaders also regarded nudity in terms of the perfection of God's creation. As a sign of his growing confidence, Michelangelo worked freehand to paint the last of his Genesis scenes, the separation of light from darkness within a single day. The ceiling was completed in late October 1512 and unveiled on the 31st to the satisfaction of the Pope, who paid Michelangelo the final installment of his 3,000 ducat fee in December. While Michelangelo was painting the heavens, there had been major developments in the earthly realm. Although a papal Spanish army had been defeated by the French at Ravenna on the 11th of April 1512, the death of the French commander Gaston de Foix prevented the French from consolidating control of northern Italy. The balance of power shifted in favor of Julius's Holy League after the arrival of 18,000 Swiss mercenaries. This enabled the papal Spanish forces to overthrow Soderini's pro-French Republican government in Florence and restore the Medici under Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici and his younger brother Giuliano. A few months later, Julius fell ill and died in February 1513, shortly after paying Michelangelo 2,000 ducats to continue work on his tomb, and leaving instructions to be buried next to his uncle Sixtus IV until its completion. Michelangelo and the late Pope's executors negotiated a modified but equally ambitious design for the tomb valued at 16,500 ducats. Meanwhile, Medici fortunes received a further boost when the 37-year-old Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici was elected Pope Leo X. Although Michelangelo had known the new pope during the days of Lorenzo the Magnificent, he and Leo did not get along. Thus, while Leo patronized Leonardo and Raphael, he showed Michelangelo no particular favor, but allowed him to continue work on his predecessor's tomb. Among the sculptures Michelangelo made for the tomb between 1513 and 1516 were The Rebellious Slave and The Dying Slave, iconic male nudes now on display in the Louvre in Paris. Michelangelo also created his Moses, a stern, bearded figure which ended up being the focus of the final tomb after its design was scaled down. Even in its more modest form, the tomb would not be completed for another 3 decades and would never accommodate Julius's body. By 1515, Michelangelo was becoming impatient with the tomb since he expected to receive major commissions from Pope Leo. Further political developments also contributed to Michelangelo's desire to cast the tomb aside. As a cardinal, Pope Leo had been one of Pope Julius's chief lieutenants, but relations between the Medici and della Rovere families deteriorated in 1516, when Leo deposed Julius's nephew, Francesco Maria della Rovere, as Duke of Urbino in favour of his own nephew Lorenzo, the 23-year-old son of the unfortunate Piero de' Medici, who was also due to take over the Florentine government. With the della Roveres in decline, Michelangelo negotiated a less ambitious design with only 21 statues, without any reduction in his fee. In the meantime, Michelangelo ingratiated himself with Domenico Buoninsegni, secretary to Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, the Pope's cousin and chief advisor. The Pope wanted to commission a facade for the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence, the family's ancestral church, and was persuaded by Buoninsegni to give Michelangelo the job. Since Michelangelo had little architectural experience, he was expected to focus on the sculptures, with the structural aspects entrusted to the architect Baccio Biggio. After agreeing terms in December 1515, Michelangelo quickly sidelined Baccio and decided to study the principles of classical architecture himself. After making initial drawings, he delivered a wooden model to Rome in December 1517, which received papal approval. In January 1518, Michelangelo signed a contract with the Pope to build the facade for 40,000 ducats. For the next 2 years, he supervised the quarrying of the vast quantity of marble required for the project. The operation involved considerable logistic challenges, and Michelangelo narrowly avoided being killed by a sliding marble column. However, the whole project stalled when the death of Duke Lorenzo of Urbino in May 1519 deprived the main Medici line of a legitimate male heir. By 1520, Michelangelo was 45 years old and still had half his life ahead of him, though he would not have known this in an age when people rarely reached 70 years, let alone the 88 that the artist would attain. His rival, Raphael, was only 37, but died unexpectedly in April. He was mourned widely and was entombed with great ceremony in the Pantheon in Rome. With Raphael dead and Leonardo in France, Michelangelo was in a league of his own in Italy. However, as Michelangelo's friend and fellow artist Sebastiano del Piombo informed him after meeting Pope Leo, "He knows you and loves you, but you frighten everyone, including popes." Following the deaths of Leo's brother Giuliano in 1516 and his nephew Lorenzo in 1519, the senior branch of the Medici consisted of the Pope himself, his cousin Cardinal Giulio, and Lorenzo's infant daughter Caterina, later Queen of France as Catherine de' Medici. The deaths in the family led Cardinal Giulio to consider a grand family mausoleum at San Lorenzo, and commissioned Michelangelo for the job. Michelangelo would complete much of the structure and made 2 magnificent tombs for the recently deceased Medici princes, but similarly elaborate tombs for Lorenzo the Magnificent and his brother Giuliano were not started. On the 1st of December 1521, the 45-year-old Pope Leo died after a short illness, and a Dutch cardinal named Adriaan Boyens was elected and enthroned as Pope Adrian VI. With Pope Leo's death, the power of the Medici was temporarily restricted to Florence, while the della Roveres were in the ascendancy after Duke Francesco Maria returned to power in Urbino. The new pope insisted on the completion of Julius's tomb, and in 1523 Michelangelo was instructed to either finish the tomb or to refund the della Roveres 8,000 ducats, a sum that was equivalent to the value of Michelangelo's property portfolio in Florence, consisting of 3 houses on the Via Ghibellina in the Santa Croce quarter. In 1520, Michelangelo had begun working on statues of 4 slaves for Julius's tomb, before turning his attention to the Medici Chapel. Meanwhile, Cardinal Giulio promised to protect Michelangelo from the consequences of his failure to work on Julius's tomb, so long as he committed to continue working on the Medici mausoleum. Mercifully for Michelangelo, and for most Romans, Pope Adrian died in September 1523, and his Medici patron Cardinal Giulio became Pope Clement VII. Work accelerated on the mausoleum at San Lorenzo, with Michelangelo at the head of a team of more than 20 people. While Pope Clement was knowledgeable about art and shared his ideas with Michelangelo, he also found the artist difficult to deal with. When the Pope commissioned the sculptor Baccio Bandinelli to carve a large sculpture of Hercules as a companion piece to Michelangelo's David, the latter was infuriated and demanded the commission for himself. The Pope reminded Michelangelo of his existing commissions, and Bandinelli proceeded to work on his Hercules and Cacus. As a consolation, Clement suggested that Michelangelo could make a colossal statue for the Piazza San Lorenzo near the Medici Palace. Michelangelo responded by ridiculing the Pope's idea, suggesting that the Colossus ought to be seated on top of an existing barber's shop with a chimney poking out via the statue's arm. Pope Clement's 1524 commission for Michelangelo to build a library for the Medici book collection was more fruitful. Clement took a close interest in Michelangelo's designs and allowed Michelangelo considerable artistic independence. The resulting creation, known as the Laurentian Library, turned architectural conventions inside out by placing imposing columns and architraves on the interior walls. While Michelangelo only managed to build the walls of the reading room, the rest of the library was built according to his instructions decades later. While Clement was a fine patron of the arts, he was a poor politician and struggled in his dealings with the two most powerful princes in Christendom, King Francis I of France and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was also King of Spain. In February 1525, a Spanish imperial army defeated a French army at the Battle of Pavia and took the French king captive. After Francis's release in 1526, Pope Clement invited him to join the Anti-Imperial League of Cognac. An incensed Charles V ordered his army to march on Florence, and while the timely arrival of a friendly army led by none other than Francesco della Rovere saved Florence, the imperial army continued on to Rome, forcing the Pope to take refuge at the Castel Sant'Angelo, the papal fortress on the banks of the Tiber that had originally been Hadrian's mausoleum. The imperial soldiers brutally sacked the city, killing thousands of Romans in the process. Meanwhile, the Medici regime in Florence collapsed, and the Republic was restored. Amidst the political instability, a plague spread through the city and claimed the life of Buonarroti Buonarroti, Michelangelo's favorite brother, in July 1528. While Michelangelo never married and had no children of his own, he assumed responsibility for the upbringing of his nieces and nephews. Despite his association with Medici popes and princes over the years, Michelangelo welcomed the restoration of the Republic, which asked him to design new fortifications for the city in summer 1528. Michelangelo's designs, which featured angular bastions offering interlocking fields of fire and low profiles to negate the impact of artillery, impressed the Florentine government, who named him to a committee supervising the militia in January 1529, and appointed him governor and procurator general of the city's fortifications in April. Michelangelo then embarked on an inspection tour of the fortifications of other Italian cities, during which he met Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, a famous soldier. The two men had met in Rome while Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel, and Alfonso reminded the artist of an earlier promise to paint something for him. Michelangelo executed on his promise the following year by painting Leda and the Swan. After returning to Florence in July, Michelangelo supervised the fortification of the hill at San Miniato, overlooking the city from the southeast. Meanwhile, Pope Clement and Emperor Charles made an agreement whereby the Pope promised the Emperor a coronation in Rome, while Charles would send his army to restore Medici rule in Florence. While some Florentines preferred diplomacy, Michelangelo and the government preferred to fight. A dispute with the government caused him to flee the city in September 1529, but he only got as far as Venice before he agreed to return to Florence and resume his duties at San Miniato. While Michelangelo's fortifications stood up to the bombardment, the imperial army blockaded the city, which capitulated after 10 months on the 12th of August 1530. As the Medici returned to power, several members of the Republican government were executed and imprisoned. Michelangelo remained in hiding for 2 weeks under the protection of the Prior of San Lorenzo. He was pardoned by Clement a few months later and asked to resume work at San Lorenzo. Although Michelangelo had regained the Pope's favor, Clement was in Rome, and in Florence the government was entrusted to Alessandro de' Medici, officially the illegitimate son of the late Lorenzo di Piero de' Medici, but rumored to be the Pope's own progeny. Alessandro was made Duke of Florence by Charles V. The 56-year-old Michelangelo was in a precarious situation, since Alessandro despised him for serving in the Republican government. Meanwhile, his father, Lodovico, had died during the previous winter, leaving him with 2 surviving brothers whom he cared little for. While Michelangelo continued work at San Lorenzo, in 1532, Pope Clement brokered a new agreement for Pope Julius's tomb, which required Michelangelo to complete 6 statues he had already started, with 5 remaining statues to be completed by others. Under the new agreement, the tomb was set against the wall of the church of San Pietro in Vincoli, an arrangement which meant the statues could be completed in a shorter space of time, as more 2-dimensional renderings. Michelangelo agreed to spend 2 months in Rome each year to work on the tomb, but his stay in 1532 proved much longer. In addition to his desire to finish the tomb, a motivating factor for Michelangelo was the presence of the young Roman aristocrat Tommaso de' Cavalieri. Michelangelo's familiarity with the male anatomy and his propensity to depict male nudes in 2 and 3 dimensions indicate that he was attracted to young men. Throughout his career, Michelangelo had worked with many young assistants, several of whom would have modeled for him in the nude. His relationship with Tommaso had a greater emotional significance, since Michelangelo wrote him many poems and gifted him several drawings. Whether their relationship was physical or platonic remains a source of debate among his biographers. Michelangelo returned to Florence in June 1533, and in September he met Pope Clement at San Miniato. The Pope asked Michelangelo to undertake further work in the Sistine Chapel, and by early 1534, Michelangelo agreed to paint the Last Judgment on the altar wall. While Michelangelo briefly went to Florence during the summer, the Pope fell seriously ill and died in September. A few days earlier, Michelangelo had left Florence, never to return to his native city again. He spent the remainder of his life in Rome, where the new pontiff, Pope Paul III, formerly Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, confirmed his predecessor's contract for the Last Judgment. On the 1st of September 1535, Paul appointed Michelangelo Supreme Architect, Sculptor and Painter of our Apostolic Palace, with an annual income of 1,200 scudi, guaranteed for life. After the necessary preparatory work and the construction of the scaffolding, Michelangelo began working on the Last Judgment in May 1536, but was in no hurry to make progress. The assassination of Alessandro de' Medici in 1537 encouraged Michelangelo's hopes of returning to Florence, but the anti-Medici forces were defeated in battle. There was nothing for Michelangelo to do but to continue working on the Last Judgment, which took him until 1541 to complete. In true Michelangelo style, the scene included hundreds of bodies of the saved and the damned, mostly naked. While most of these were male, Michelangelo also included a group of female saints and martyrs. This may have been inspired by his friendship with Vittorio Colonna, a widowed noblewoman and poet who was Michelangelo's closest female friend. While painting the wall, Michelangelo suffered a serious accident after falling from the scaffolding. He was nursed back to health by his friend, the Florentine doctor Baccio Rontini. On the 31st of October 1541, exactly 29 years since Michelangelo completed the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, his Last Judgment was unveiled to the public. Although widely praised for its beauty, it also had plenty of critics who were appalled by the amount of nudity on display. Meanwhile, Francesco Maria della Rovere had died in 1538, and his son Guido Baldo inherited the unenviable task of urging Michelangelo to complete Julius II's tomb. As soon as Michelangelo completed the Last Judgment, the Pope commissioned him to decorate his new Cappella Paolina with frescoes. With Michelangelo now 67 years old, Guido Baldo urged him to finish the tomb, requesting only 3 sculptures from him, including the one of Moses. While Michelangelo could have supplied his rebellious slave and dying slave, he decided that the nude figures would have been inappropriate for a papal tomb at a time when the Catholic Church's decadence was under assault by Protestants throughout Europe. Instead, Michelangelo began making 2 chaste female figures, Leah and Rachel, representing the contemplative life and the active life. He hoped to delegate their completion to another sculptor, but when Guido Baldo refused to ratify the agreement, he decided to finish them himself. Meanwhile, in November 1542, Michelangelo began working on his frescoes for the Cappella Paolina, the Conversion of Saul, and the Crucifixion of St. Peter. These paintings, the last that Michelangelo produced, marked an abrupt change in style, reflecting a more pessimistic outlook on humanity compared to the perfection of the human forms in the Sistine Chapel. In early 1545, 40 years after the original commission, Michelangelo finally completed work on Julius's tomb. Although significantly less ambitious than its original conception, Michelangelo had nevertheless created a magnificent wall tomb, and the sculpture of Moses is considered one of the greatest masterpieces of Renaissance sculpture today. In 1546, Michelangelo was 71 years old and had begun work on his Crucifixion of St. Peter for the Cappella Paolina, which would take him 4 years to complete. He had outlived most of his contemporaries, by decades in some cases, and following the death of Antonio da San Gallo the Younger in August, he was appointed chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica in January 1547. In late February, Michelangelo was left bereft by the death of his friend Vittorio Colonna. He himself was suffering from a series of ailments common in old age, but had enough creative energy left to design some of Rome's most iconic architectural landmarks. After assuming responsibility for St. Peter's, Michelangelo scrapped San Gallo's plans to extend the building with a nave and returned to a design based on Bramante's original conception of a Greek cross, modifying it with curved and angular surfaces to increase the dramatic effect. Michelangelo also modified Bramante's design for the dome, which would rest on 4 smaller domes at the corners. Michelangelo designed a taller dome, supported by 4 heavy piers in the interior of the basilica. By the time of his death in 1564, only the drum of the dome had been completed, but the design remained largely unchanged when it was finally finished in 1590. While working on St. Peter's, Michelangelo also completed the Palazzo Farnese for the Pope. He achieved this by building an upper floor with a large overhanging cornice that seemed disproportionate, but which gave the structure additional gravitas. Another major architectural project was the redesign of the piazza at the Campidoglio, or Capitoline Hill, the seat of Rome's civic administration. Michelangelo appears to have begun making plans for this a decade earlier, when Paul III commissioned him to design a plinth to accommodate the ancient equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, which was transferred to the piazza for Emperor Charles V's visit in 1538. Michelangelo's task was complicated by the fact that the two government palaces, the Palazzo Senatorio and the Palazzo dei Conservatori, were built at an awkward 80-degree angle from each other. Michelangelo's innovative solution was to design a new palace, the Palazzo Nuovo, opposite the Palazzo dei Conservatori at the same 80-degree angle to the Palazzo Senatorio, thereby transforming the piazza into a symmetrical trapezium. In order to bring architectural coherence to the ensemble, he designed new facades for the two existing palaces, with the new Palazzo Nuovo as a mirror image of the Palazzo dei Conservatori. He then designed an oval-shaped pavement pattern with a star in the center, where the statue of Marcus Aurelius stood, and transformed the northwestern slope of the hill into a grand staircase. Work progressed slowly, and by the time of Michelangelo's death, only the staircase had been completed. Michelangelo's design was not realized in full for another century, with the completion of the Palazzo Nuovo in 1654. In November 1549, Pope Paul III died after an unexpectedly long 15-year reign. Not long before his death, the pontiff had climbed up the scaffolding to examine Michelangelo's almost completed crucifixion of St. Peter in the Cappella Paolina in the Vatican Palace. Afterwards, he issued a papal directive asserting that Michelangelo's design for St. Peter's was never to be changed. One wonders if Paul had noticed when he visited that Michelangelo was painting himself into the picture in a disguised manner, clothed in a red tunic and a blue turban, while standing in the top left corner of the crowd. Michelangelo continued to enjoy the support of Paul's successor Julius III, but he was targeted by critics who attacked him for the nudity in his Last Judgment and his conduct in the protracted affair of Julius II's tomb. Although his friend Giorgio Vasari had written a glowing account of Michelangelo's life in his Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors and Architects, Michelangelo instructed his assistant Ascanio Condivi to write a second biography to correct some of Vasari's perceived mistakes and to answer the charges of his critics. The death of Julius III in 1555 strengthened Michelangelo's critics, as Julius's near successor, Pope Paul IV, planned to move away from the decadence of the Church in line with the new Counter-Reformation movement. He retained Michelangelo as the chief architect of St. Peter's and sought his advice on architectural matters, but did not renew his annual allowance. By then, the artist was already a wealthy man, with much of his assets invested in Florentine property or held in Florentine banks, due to be inherited by his nephew, Leonardo Buonarroti. He resisted efforts by Duke Cosimo I de' Medici to lure him back to Florence, but gave written instructions to enable the completion of the staircase to the Laurentian Library. Michelangelo's fortunes improved after Paul IV's death in August 1559, which led to the election of Pius IV, who restored Michelangelo's salary in June 1560. At this time, he produced an ambitious design for the Church of San Giovanni di Fiorentini for the city's Florentine community, which was never realized, though a less ambitious project for the Sforza Chapel at the Papal Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore was completed after his death. Michelangelo was in his mid-80s and his health was in serious decline. In August 1561, he collapsed in his workshop and lay on the floor unconscious for 3 hours until his servant discovered him. He survived to carry out a commission by Pius IV to design the Porta Pia, a ceremonial gate in the Aurelian walls of Rome, situated at the end of a new avenue, the Via Pia. Michelangelo did not live to see its completion and died on the 18th of February 1564, a few weeks short of his 89th birthday. He was given a grand funeral in Rome and buried at the Church of Santi Apostoli, but Duke Cosimo ordered Michelangelo's body to be exhumed and brought to Florence for burial at Santa Croce, where it lies to this day in an elaborate tomb designed by Giorgio Vasari. Alongside Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael, Michelangelo is celebrated as one of the greatest artists of the Renaissance. Although sculpture was his preferred art form, he also excelled as a painter, architect, and poet. His legacy includes breathtaking marble sculptures such as the Pietà, David, and Moses, or inspiring frescoes in the Sistine Chapel, and architectural masterpieces in Florence and Rome, including the Laurentian Library, the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, and the staircase and piazza of the Capitoline Hill. His extraordinary abilities ensured that, despite his incessant demands for money and his revolutionary desire to be treated as an equal, he was patronized by Florentine rulers and popes over 7 decades, and, unlike many artists, he died a wealthy and famous man. Michelangelo's skill in depicting the human form had its detractors, and shortly before his death, other artists began covering up the offending parts in his Last Judgment, a process that continued for 2 centuries. His design for St. Peter's was also not realized in its final form, after the architect Carlo Maderno reintroduced a nave and built a large facade, which obscured Michelangelo's dome from St. Peter's Square. His work had been restored to its original form in many places in modern times. What do you think of Michelangelo? Was he an artistic genius who created some of the greatest artistic masterpieces in human history? Or did his attitude towards his patrons and his insistence on doing all of the work himself, instead of employing assistants, prevent him from executing projects that would have been even greater and grander? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.